Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Please take just a moment to subscribe to this channel. And down in the comments, tell me where you are watching from. Your city, your state, your country. I want to know who is listening to what I am about to share with you. Because what you are about to hear is not fiction. This is not Hollywood. This happened. On a single afternoon in August 1944, one American fighter pilot made a decision that defied every regulation, every order, every principle of military discipline he had ever been taught. He did it in full view of the enemy. He did it knowing it could end his career, his life, or both. And what followed was 30 minutes of fear, physics, friendship, and impossible luck that still defies belief 80 years later. This story will take you into the cockpit of a North American P-51 Mustang flying dangerously overloaded across occupied France with German guns tracking every second of its flight. It will take you into the mind of a man who chose loyalty over survival. And by the time we reach the end, you will understand why some acts of courage are so dangerous that even the military does not know whether to punish them or praise them. Stay with me. This gets more intense with every passing minute. The sky over northern France on the morning of August 18, 1944, was pale and hazy, the kind of thin summer overcast that dissolved into blue as the sun climbed higher. Beneath it, the war had turned. The Allies had broken out of Normandy. German forces were retreating eastward in confusion and desperation, but they were far from beaten. Every hedgerow, every crossroad, every patch of open ground still belonged to whoever held the guns, and the guns were everywhere. Lieutenant Royce Priest did not think about strategy that morning. He thought about altitude, about fuel, about keeping his engine temperatures steady as his P-51 Mustang climbed through 8,000 feet in tight formation with the rest of his squadron. The Mustang was a beautiful machine, sleek and fast, with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that could pull it to 40,000 feet and a range that let it escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But beauty did not matter at 8,000 feet over enemy territory. What mattered was discipline. What mattered was staying in position, scanning the horizon, keeping your eyes moving, trusting the man on your wing. The man Priest trusted most was flying ahead of him. Major Bert Marshall was not just the squadron commander. He was the kind of pilot other pilots measured themselves against. He had 5 confirmed kills. He flew with an aggression that bordered on recklessness, but it was the kind of recklessness that came from absolute confidence in his machine and his instincts. He believed in pressing the attack, in never giving the enemy a moment to recover, in taking risks that other men would not take. He had survived 2 years of combat by being faster, sharper, and more willing to push his aircraft to the edge than anyone else in the squadron. He was loud, profane, demanding, and completely uninterested in being liked. But he was respected. And for Royce Priest, who had arrived in England only months earlier, still learning the rhythm of combat, still fighting down the fear that came every time the engine started, Marshall was more than a commander. He was proof that you could survive this. The mission that morning was supposed to be routine, ground attack. The squadron had been tasked with striking German convoys retreating through the French countryside south of Paris, columns of trucks and armored vehicles racing eastward to escape encirclement. Intelligence had identified a road junction near the town of Chartres where German forces were concentrating. The orders were simple: find the convoy, hit it hard, get out, do not linger, do not take unnecessary risks. The German anti-aircraft defenses in France had grown more deadly as the front collapsed. Desperate men with 88mm guns were not concerned with self-preservation. They were concerned with killing as many Allied aircraft as possible before the war consumed them. Priest felt the vibration of the Merlin engine through the control stick as the squadron leveled off at 12,000 feet and began the descent toward the target area. Below, the landscape of France spread out in geometric patterns of green and gold, fields separated by dark lines of hedgerows and narrow roads, villages clustered around church steeples, rivers winding silver through the haze. It looked peaceful from altitude. It was not. Somewhere down there, camouflaged beneath trees and farmhouses and haystacks, German gunners were tracking the sound of American engines, swiveling their barrels upward, waiting for the moment when the fighters would commit to their attack run and become predictable. Marshall's voice crackled over the radio, terse and focused. He had spotted the convoy. Priest saw it a moment later, a thin, dark line snaking along a road that cut through open farmland, vehicles moving slowly, spaced apart, trying to avoid presenting a concentrated target. Marshall was already rolling into his dive, the nose of his Mustang dropping sharply, speed building. The rest of the squadron followed. Priest pushed the stick forward and felt the familiar surge of acceleration, the horizon tilting, the ground rushing upward, the sound of the engine rising to a scream. His airspeed climbed past 300 miles per hour. The convoy grew larger, resolving into individual shapes: trucks, half-tracks, soldiers scattering into the ditches. And then the sky exploded. The German gunners had been waiting. They had hidden their positions with extraordinary care, dug into the edges of fields, covered with netting and branches, invisible until the moment they opened fire. The anti-aircraft fire erupted from multiple points around the convoy, not the scattered bursts of light flak that Priest had seen before, but heavy, concentrated fire from 88mm batteries that filled the air with black clouds of shrapnel and concussive force. The explosions were so close that Priest felt the shock waves through the airframe, felt the Mustang shudder and buck as fragments tore through the air inches from his wings. He broke hard left, instinct overriding thought, yanking the stick and feeling the G-forces slam him down into his seat, the horizon spinning, his vision narrowing at the edges. Tracers streaked past, bright and impossibly fast. The radio was chaos, voices shouting warnings, calling out positions, cursing. Priest pulled out of the dive without firing a shot, climbing hard, trying to gain altitude and distance from the killing zone below. His heart hammered against his ribs. His hands were slick inside his gloves. He scanned the sky, counting aircraft, trying to reorient himself. And then he saw it. Marshall's Mustang was trailing smoke. It was not the thick black smoke of a fuel fire or the sudden catastrophic plume of an engine explosion. It was a thin, steady stream of white vapor leaking from the belly of the aircraft, barely visible against the haze. But Priest knew what it meant: coolant. The Merlin engine was liquid-cooled, and if the coolant system was compromised, the engine would overheat within minutes. Without coolant, the massive 12-cylinder power plant would seize, the pistons would lock, and the propeller would stop turning. And when that happened, Marshall would have two choices: bail out over enemy territory or try to glide the aircraft down and crash land before the engine failed completely. Priest's stomach clenched. He banked toward Marshall's position, closing the distance, watching the smoke trail grow slightly thicker. Marshall's voice came over the radio, calm but tight. He had taken a hit. He was losing coolant. He was going to have to put the aircraft down. He did not sound afraid. He sounded angry. The rest of the squadron was already reforming, climbing away from the flak zone, abandoning the attack. The convoy was too heavily defended. The mission was over. Standard doctrine in this situation was clear. If a pilot went down behind enemy lines, the rest of the squadron would note the position, report it to intelligence, and hope that the pilot could evade capture long enough for the resistance to smuggle him out through Spain or Switzerland. Rescue attempts were not authorized. Landing a single-seat fighter in enemy territory to pick up a downed pilot was not just forbidden, it was considered suicidal. The aircraft were not designed to carry 2 men. The fields were too short, too rough, too exposed. And even if you managed to get both men into the cockpit, the Mustang would be dangerously overloaded, barely able to fly, a sitting target for every German gun within range. Royce Priest knew all of this. He had been briefed on it. He had signed documents acknowledging that he understood it. And as he watched Marshall's Mustang descend toward the French countryside, trailing that thin white line of vapor, he also knew that he was not going to follow that doctrine. Marshall was trying to stretch his glide, aiming for a large open field bordered by woods about 2 miles east of the convoy. The engine was still running, still producing some power, but the temperature gauge would be climbing into the red, the metal components inside the engine block expanding, the oil beginning to burn. Priest followed him down, staying close, scanning the ground for German positions, for vehicles, for any sign of immediate danger. He saw farmhouses. He saw narrow roads. He saw haystacks and hedgerows and a small stone church in the distance. And he saw the field marshal was aiming for, a broad expanse of golden wheat that looked flat and smooth from altitude but could hide ditches, rocks, fences, anything that would flip an aircraft onto its back and crush the pilot inside. Marshall's landing was controlled but brutal. The Mustang came in low and fast, too fast, the wheels touching down and immediately throwing up a cloud of dust and torn wheat stalks as the aircraft bounced, settled, bounced again, and then skidded forward, the tail lifting, the nose dipping dangerously low before the tail settled back down and the Mustang rolled to a stop in the middle of the field, tilted slightly to one side, the propeller bent, the engine silent. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the canopy slid back, and Marshall climbed out onto the wing, dropped to the ground, and started running toward the tree line. Priest was already circling, his mind racing, calculating angles and distances and impossibilities. The field was long enough, barely, maybe 800 feet of clear ground before the trees. The wheat was tall, but the ground looked level, no visible obstructions, no power lines. The wind was light, almost calm. If he came in from the west, he could use the full length of the field, touch down as slowly as possible, and roll to a stop before he hit the trees, if the ground held. If the wheat was not hiding a drainage ditch, if no German patrol arrived in the next 60 seconds. He did not think about court-martial. He did not think about regulations. He thought about Marshall running alone through enemy territory, about the German vehicles he had seen near the convoy, about how fast a determined enemy could cover 2 miles, about how few options a man on foot had in open farmland controlled by an army that shot prisoners. He thought about the fact that Marshall had taught him how to lead a target, how to manage fuel on long missions, how to stay calm when the flak was close. He thought about the fact that every pilot in the squadron knew that Marshall would do the same for any of them, without hesitation. Priest keyed his radio and told the rest of the squadron what he was going to do. There was a moment of silence. Then someone told him he was insane. Someone else told him not to do it. A third voice, quieter, told him to be fast. He dropped his landing gear and began his approach. The Mustang felt wrong immediately. It was not designed for short field landings. It was designed for speed, for altitude, for long runways with concrete and lighting and ground crews standing by. Bringing it into a wheat field behind enemy lines at minimum controllable airspeed was like threading a needle while falling off a roof. Priest kept his eyes locked on the far end of the field, adjusting his descent angle, bleeding off speed, feeling the controls go mushy as the airspeed dropped below 100 miles per hour. The stall warning buffet started to vibrate through the stick. He ignored it. He needed to be slow. If he came in too fast, he would not be able to stop before the trees. If he came in too slow, He would stall and drop like a stone and probably cartwheel across the field, in a spray of torn metal and burning fuel. The wheels touched down hard, the landing gear compressing, the entire airframe shaking as the Mustang bounced once, twice, then settled onto the uneven ground and began to decelerate, the tail wheel dragging through the wheat, the brakes screaming. Priest stood on the brakes, feeling the aircraft slow, watching the trees at the end of the field grow larger, closer, too close. The Mustang was still rolling, still too fast. He pumped the brakes, felt them grab, felt the nose dip forward, and then, finally, mercifully, the aircraft stopped, 50 feet from the tree line, the engine idling, the propeller turning lazily, the smell of scorched brake pads thick in the cockpit. Priest did not shut down the engine. He turned in his seat, scanning the field, looking for Marshall. And then he saw him, running hard across the wheat, his flight suit dark with sweat, his face flushed and furious and focused. He reached the Mustang, grabbed the trailing edge of the wing, and pulled himself up. Priest was already out of his seat, balancing on the edge of the cockpit, shouting over the engine noise. There was no room. The cockpit was designed for one man. The seat, the instrument panel, the control stick, the rudder pedals, everything was built to precise tolerances with no space to spare. Getting two full-grown men into that cockpit was going to require stripping away everything that was not essential, and then cramming themselves into a space that was fundamentally too small. Priest reached back and pulled out his parachute, the heavy pack that he had strapped to his back before takeoff, the one piece of equipment that might save his life if the aircraft went down. He threw it onto the ground. He pulled out his survival kit, the emergency rations, the maps, the flares, everything. He threw it all onto the ground, into the wheat, a deliberate, irrevocable signal. He was not leaving without Marshall. There was no backup plan. Marshall understood immediately. He climbed into the cockpit first, wedging himself down into the narrow footwell in front of the seat, his knees bent, his back pressed against the instrument panel, his head below the level of the windscreen. Priest climbed in after him, settling into the seat, his legs straddling Marshall's shoulders, his feet barely reaching the rudder pedals. The canopy would not close completely. There was not enough room. Priest pulled it down as far as it would go and locked it in place, leaving a gap of several inches. The wind would roar through that gap at 200 miles per hour. It did not matter. Nothing mattered except getting this aircraft into the air and keeping it there long enough to cross the front lines. Priest advanced the throttle and felt the Mustang start to roll forward, the engine responding, the propeller biting into the air. The aircraft felt wrong. It felt heavy, sluggish, unbalanced. The nose wanted to dip. The tail wanted to rise. He pushed the stick forward slightly, trying to keep the tail wheel on the ground, building speed, feeling the wheat stalks whipping against the fuselage. The far end of the field was coming up fast. He needed more speed. The Mustang was not accelerating fast enough. The extra weight was killing the takeoff performance. He kept the throttle full forward, kept the stick neutral, willing the aircraft to fly. The airspeed indicator crept upward. 60 miles per hour, 70, 80, still not enough. The trees were 100 feet away. 50. Priest pulled back on the stick, hauling the nose up, forcing the Mustang into the air before it was ready, and the aircraft staggered off the ground, the wheels clearing the wheat by inches, the wings wobbling, the stall buffet shaking the entire airframe. He held the stick steady, resisting the urge to pull back harder, letting the speed build, trading altitude for airspeed, keeping the nose just above the horizon. The Mustang clawed its way into the air, clearing the trees by less than 10 feet, the engine screaming, the controls barely responsive. They were airborne, barely. Priest leveled off at 500 feet, the lowest altitude he dared, trying to stay below the horizon, trying to make the aircraft as small a target as possible. The engine temperature was already climbing. The Merlin was designed to cool itself at high speed and high altitude, and they were flying low and slow, with more than twice the normal weight pressing down on every component. The coolant temperature gauge was edging toward the red line. The oil pressure was fluctuating. The engine was protesting. Its finely tuned systems pushed far beyond their design limits. Marshall could not see anything from his position crammed into the footwell. He could only feel the vibration of the engine, the turbulence rattling the airframe, the G-forces pressing him down as Priest made shallow turns to avoid flying in a straight line. He did not speak. There was nothing to say. Priest's hands were locked on the controls, his eyes scanning the instruments, the horizon, the ground below. They were flying east, away from the convoy, away from the heaviest concentrations of German forces, but every second they remained over occupied France was a second they could be spotted, tracked, engaged. The radio was alive with voices. The rest of the squadron had formed up around them, flying escort, watching for enemy fighters, calling out landmarks, offering encouragement that sounded hollow and desperate. The first 10 minutes were the worst. Priest did not know if the engine would hold together. He did not know if the Germans had scrambled fighters to intercept them. He did not know if the next patch of trees would hide another flak battery. He flew by instinct, making constant small adjustments to heading and altitude, trying to keep the aircraft stable, trying to keep the engine from overheating completely, trying to ignore the sweat running into his eyes and the cramping in his legs, and the voice in his head that kept whispering that this was not going to work. But the engine kept running, the propeller kept turning, the wings kept generating lift, and slowly, agonizingly, the landmarks below began to change. The dense patchwork of fields and villages gave way to open countryside. The roads became less frequent. The rivers grew wider. They were getting closer to the front lines, closer to territory that Allied forces had already liberated, closer to safety. The coolant temperature was deep in the red now. The engine was running on borrowed time, its internal components expanding and grinding against tolerances that were never meant to be exceeded. Priest could hear the strain in the engine note, a roughness that had not been there before, a vibration that suggested something inside was coming apart. He eased back on the throttle slightly, trying to reduce the load, but the aircraft immediately began to sink. He added throttle again, accepting the heat, accepting the risk, because losing altitude meant losing options and they were still over enemy territory. Marshall's legs had gone numb. The position he was wedged into cut off circulation to his lower body, and he could feel the tingling, burning sensation spreading from his feet up through his calves and thighs. He shifted slightly, trying to find a position that would relieve the pressure, but there was no room to move. He was trapped, blind, helpless, completely dependent on the man sitting above him, and the only thing he could do was stay still and trust that Priest knew what he was doing. 20 minutes into the flight, they crossed the front lines. Priest did not know exactly when it happened. There was no clear boundary, no line on the ground separating Allied and German forces, but the radio chatter changed. The landmarks below began to match the maps he had studied. The tension in his shoulders eased fractionally. They were not safe yet, but they were no longer flying over an enemy who could kill them at any moment. The English Channel appeared on the horizon, a gray-blue line separating France from England, and Priest felt something close to relief. The engine was still running. The aircraft was still flying. They had made it this far, but the channel was 20 miles wide, and the engine temperature was now so far into the red that the needle had stopped moving. If the engine seized over water, they would ditch, and ditching a Mustang was almost always fatal. The aircraft's belly scoop would catch the water and flip the plane inverted in seconds, trapping both men inside as it sank. Priest climbed slightly, trading speed for altitude, trying to gain enough height that if the engine quit, they might be able to glide to the English coast. The Mustang responded sluggishly, the extra weight making every maneuver feel like pushing through mud. The escort fighters stayed close, their presence a fragile comfort. If Priest had to ditch, there was nothing they could do except watch and report the position. The coast of England came into view, the white cliffs emerging from the haze, and Priest allowed himself to believe, for the first time since he had touched down in that wheat field, that they might actually survive this. The engine was still running, still producing power, though the sound had deteriorated into a rough, uneven roar that suggested catastrophic failure was only minutes away. He descended towards Steeple Morton, the airfield where their squadron was based, calling ahead on the radio, requesting priority landing, warning the tower that he had an emergency, that he was overweight, that he was not sure the aircraft would make it to the runway. The tower cleared him for immediate landing. Fire trucks rolled out onto the tarmac. Priest lined up on final approach, dropped the landing gear, and felt the Mustang slow even further, the controls going mushy, the stall buffet starting again. He kept the nose down, kept the speed up as much as he dared, aiming for the threshold of the runway. The wheels touched down hard, the landing gear compressing, and Priest stood on the brakes, feeling the tires skid, feeling the aircraft slow. And then, finally, the Mustang rolled to a stop in the middle of the runway, the engine coughing once, twice, and then falling silent. For a long moment, neither man moved. Priest sat in the seat, his hands still gripping the control stick, his body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. Marshall was wedged in the footwell, unable to stand, unable to move his legs. Priest climbed out first, dropping onto the wing, and then reached down to help Marshall. It took 3 men to pull him out of the cockpit. When his feet touched the ground, his legs collapsed. He could not stand. The circulation had been cut off for too long. Ground crew members caught him, lowered him to the tarmac, and began massaging his legs, trying to restore feeling, while Marshall cursed and laughed and shook his head in disbelief. The Mustang sat on the runway, its engine ticking as it cooled, its bent propeller and scarred fuselage testament to what it had just endured. Mechanics would later find that the coolant system had been shot through, the engine had been running dry for most of the flight back, and several internal components had come within millimeters of catastrophic failure. If the flight had lasted 5 more minutes, the engine would have seized completely. The reaction to what Priest had done was immediate and divided. Some of the pilots treated him like a hero, slapping his back, buying him drinks, retelling the story with awe and admiration. Others were furious, arguing that he had violated fundamental regulations, that he had endangered himself and Marshall unnecessarily, that if everyone started landing behind enemy lines to pick up down pilots, the squadron would be decimated within a week. The squadron commander was faced with an impossible situation. Priest had clearly violated standing orders. He had disobeyed direct regulations that existed for good reason. But he had also saved the life of a respected officer, and he had done it with extraordinary skill and courage. The decision went up the chain of command. Reports were filed. Statements were taken. And eventually, the case reached the desk of Major General James Doolittle, the commanding general of the 8th Air Force, the man who had led the famous raid on Tokyo in 1942, the man who understood better than almost anyone the difference between recklessness and calculated risk. Doolittle read the reports. He interviewed witnesses. He studied the mission logs, and then he made his decision. Priest would not be court-martialed. Instead, he would be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor, recognizing extraordinary heroism in combat. It was not the Medal of Honor, the highest award. because Doolittle understood that endorsing what Priest had done without reservation would encourage other pilots to attempt similar rescues, and most of those attempts would end in disaster. The award was carefully calibrated, honoring Priest's courage while stopping short of making him a model to be emulated. The rescue had consequences beyond Priest and Marshall. Other pilots, inspired by the story, attempted their own behind-the-lines rescues in the months that followed. Some succeeded, many did not. Aircraft were lost, lives were lost. The line between heroism and foolishness proved impossible to define in advance, knowable only in retrospect, only after the wheels touched down or the aircraft exploded or the pilot was captured. Marshall returned to flight status within days, his legs regaining full function, his reputation enhanced not diminished by the experience. He flew combat missions until the end of the war, adding more victories to his record, leading his squadron with the same aggressive confidence that had defined his career. He never forgot what Priest had done. He never stopped telling the story, never stopped insisting that Priest had saved his life when everyone else would have left him behind. Priest continued flying as well, completing his tour, surviving the war, returning home to a country that was trying to forget the fear and loss and darkness of the previous 4 years. He did not talk much about the rescue. When people asked, he said he had done what anyone would have done, though he knew that was not true. He had done what almost no one would have done, and he had survived by a combination of skill, determination, and luck so absurd that it seemed like providence. The two men remained friends for the rest of their lives. They attended reunions. They exchanged letters. They grew old together, watching the world change, watching the war recede into history, watching new generations grow up who could not imagine what it had been like to fly a damaged fighter across enemy territory with the engine temperature in the red and a friend's life balanced on every decision. They never spoke about whether it had been worth it. That question had no answer. It simply was. A moment in time when one man refused to leave another behind, when loyalty mattered more than survival, when the rules were broken because the alternative was unthinkable. And now you have heard the story. 30 minutes of fear and physics and friendship that happened 80 years ago over the fields of France and the waters of the English Channel. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it, then please take a moment to like this video. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that real history, told honestly and completely, matters more than mythology. And I want to ask you a question. If you had been Royce Priest that day, circling above that wheat field, knowing the regulations, knowing the risks, knowing that the smart decision, the safe decision, the correct decision was to fly away and report the loss, would you have landed? Would you have thrown away your parachute and crammed yourself into that cockpit and flown that overloaded aircraft back across enemy territory? Would you have risked everything for a friend? Think about it, and then tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Your city, your state, your country. Because this story belongs to all of us. It is a reminder that even in the darkest moments of history, even in the midst of war and chaos and terror, people are capable of extraordinary acts of loyalty and courage. And that is worth remembering.